Thank you, Mr. Hassan, for those very kind words. I paid him a lot of money to say that, by the way. Good afternoon, or shall I say good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me here. I'm delighted that my friend Mr. Jones is here. We had a wonderful conversation earlier today. Thank you, Jim. You're doing great work. Really appreciate what you do. Nikolai, where are you? So Nikolai made the mistake of inviting me, actually. And I've had such a wonderful day here. I went to the Clinton Library. We looked around, and Bob G took us around. And Bob, thank you so much. You are the volunteer of the world. Really. I'm not going to bore you for too long. What I hope we will do is have this as a conversation. I want to share some ideas. We came to the conclusion that perhaps we can talk about partnerships. We can talk about what the UN is doing, or sometimes not doing when it comes to what we call smart partnerships and smart philanthropy. I'm a strong believer that traditional aid and traditional charity, while it is very important, should be viewed from the prism of sustainability. And when you think of it, we all feel obligated to help the underprivileged. And when we do that, we have to make it on the basis that it's not a hands-out approach, but a hands-up approach. And I want to tell you how the UN has been kind of at the forefront of some of these partnerships. But before I go into that, how many of you have studied the work of the United Nations here? A fair few. So I won't go too much into the detail, what we call the inner workings of the UN, but maybe some things you might find interesting to learn about. And this year is a very important year for the United Nations. It will be celebrating in October of this year its 70th birthday. The UN was born actually in San Francisco in June of 1945, when 51 countries got together to try and address the scourge of the Second World War, and that we should never have another situation like that. Although sometimes we wonder, when we have so many people dying of many conflicts around the world. And I'll tell you something, there are now nearly 70 mini conflicts all over the world. About 10 get reported on a regular basis. But the others we often don't hear about, and people impacted as a result of that, and they have to migrate, and they become refugees, etc. Today, the UN has 193 member states, what we call. So it's grown over the years, and I'm not, in 5 years' time, there might be a few more countries added. The last country which was added was in 2011, when South Sudan became independent. And we are so thrilled that despite all of its challenges, South Sudan is trying to come out and become more self-sustaining, and hopefully there will be peace in that region very soon. So the term United Nations was coined by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1941, incidentally. The UN actually sits on land donated by another great American, a businessman, John D. Rockefeller. The currency of the UN is the US dollar. So everything is US about it, by the way. Sometimes the UN tends to forget that. All of you, all of us, we contribute 22% of the UN's budget, incidentally. So whatever happens around the world, bear in mind that you own the UN. You have a big stake in the UN. So you should see the UN as part of your life, part of your society. when you think of what's happening, let's say, in addressing children's issues, health, education, environmental issues. Up in Canada, there's an organization which deals with air traffic control, for example. They provide the overall guidelines. In the UK, there's the International Maritime Organization, which provides guidance to shipping. WHO, the World Health Organization, provides the guidance for norms and standards. When Ebola happened, it was WHO working hand in hand with CDC, for example. So there are a number of issues which impact our day-to-day lives are really built around the work of the UN as well. And I want to show you this slide. If you look at this, the charter, when it was commissioned in 1945, it starts with the words, "We, the peoples of the United Nations." And you will see it is an international treaty which every member state of the United Nations subscribes to. And there are 6 basic principles on international relations. And they all agree to that charter. Now I want to use the thing just to show you. These are the 6 basic principles. And as you will see, these are principles which you and I believe in, subscribe to, live by, etc. And that's what member states commit to. Now, I use the term member states simply because it is technically member states of the United Nations, but its governments is the people. So it's the member states who represent the people, the electorate, if you like. And one of the things it says in Principle 4, they are to refrain from the threat or use of force against any other state, to try and address disputes in a peaceful manner. And then finally, if you look at number 6, nothing in the Charter is to authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any member state. If you look back in the last decade or so, there have been situations where failed states have not been able to address some of the internal strife. When Kofi Annan, then Secretary General, was in office, he introduced the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect. That's when governments themselves are not able to address that issue themselves. In those situations, the United Nations Security Council might authorize some kind of activity to try and help the people who are impacted by the crisis. So that is a new concept which has come together. And it is actually quite impressive that the Security Council is starting to act on some of these issues. South Sudan was a classic example. East Timor was another one before that, for example. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what sometimes you don't hear what the UN does, and I will see if I can come to that. So as I said, the UN is 70 this year. UN provides food for 90 million people around the world. And just think of it, 80 countries. So 80 countries are still struggling with the lack of appropriate food and security. There are many great NGOs, and I was very enlightened to hear about the local NGO, Hella International. I think it's Heifer International. The work they're doing, for example, to address the plight of the underprivileged. Why is it? People are beginning to realize that governments cannot do it alone. Neither can the private sector, neither can the civil society, neither can you individually. But when you work together, you improve the chances of success. And a lot of the UN's programs are actually being delivered as a result of collaboration and cooperation through partnerships. If you look at the second last issue, which is a very important point, that the UN uses diplomacy to prevent conflicts. This term is often used as preventive diplomacy. Now, we were talking earlier, Mr. Jones and I, that when you talk about conflicts and wars, etc., you often do not pick up or capture information about what has been, if you like, avoided, when people's lives have been saved. We are very quick to capture that X 100,000 people died as a result of either an illness, an epidemic or pandemic, or a war. But through preventive diplomacy, the United Nations is able to avoid some of the conflicts. The UN is a great place to talk, by the way. Everybody loves to talk. They come there, and you can see some of the very interesting drama which often takes place at the United Nations when heads of states, prime ministers, presidents come, bang on the podium, and share their views. It's much better that they're there, shouting at each other, than to going into battle. And that's ultimately the hope and desire, that the UN is a home for discussion, for reconciliation, and for peaceful coexistence. And all of this takes place through the overall prism of collaboration, through partnerships. So at the United Nations, partnerships is not new. One of the earliest partners for the UN, I think in 1946, was the Red Cross. Red Cross became kind of a approved NGO at the United Nations when it partnered with UNICEF to help address the aftermath of the Second World War. Since then, the UN has accredited a number of NGOs. Today, there are well over 10,000 NGOs who collaborate, support, work with, engage with the United Nations. And when I say the United Nations, I want to show you, this is the United Nations. It is beyond an alphabet soup. But when I said earlier, the United Nations is all things to all people, one way or another. If you look at the top, there are 6 organs of the United Nations, basically. When it was set up, it was premised on the basis that it would be democratic, starting with the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is all of the governments coming together, 193 of them. Then you have the Security Council, which consists of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 countries who came together after the Second World War to say we must uphold peace and security in the world. And how many of you know which are the 5 permanent members? Who will take a guess? I know you guys know it. You're the experts in this. How about you, young lady? Yes, have a guess.
Well, the United States.
Yes?
Russia.
Yes?
England.
Yes? UK? Yes?
Yes. UK.
Yes?
France.
Yes?
And
China.
Japan.
China.
China.
Very good, actually. Absolutely. So these are the 5 countries and they hold a veto power at the United Nations. Plus, there are 10 more who are appointed on a 2-year basis and rotated. And they all participate in the discussions, and they pass resolutions relating to peace, security, and human rights. Under that umbrella comes peacekeeping, peace building, preventive diplomacy, human rights issues, human rights abuses, etc., and you'll see from there. And then there's the Economic and Social Council. So I showed you the chart about UN at 70. Those are the economic and social issues which the United Nations aims to address globally. The Economic and Social Council consists of 54 member states of the UN, represented in a very proportional way, all the regional groups, whether it's Europe, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, Asia Pacific, Middle East, etc. So all of these groups are represented in the Economic and Social Council, and they look at the issues relating to the Millennium Development Goals and the new Sustainable Development Goals. So here's another question, not to the experts in the Clinton School. MDGs, who can tell me about is an MDG? Yes?
And I know it's a list of different goals, but I know one was like to reduce poverty by half in so many years.
2015, absolutely. So that's exactly right. So MDGs stand for the Millennium Development Goals. These were adopted in September 2000 at the Millennium Summit, where 147 heads of states and government got together and adopted these 8 goals which included exactly the way you described it: reduce poverty by half across the world by 2015, address the issue of parity of education for boys and girls, ensure primary education for all, and so on. These 8 goals expire at the end of this year, and they will then be transformed into a new set of goals which are being currently developed and hopefully will be approved in September 2015 at the United Nations at a major summit which will take place, a historic summit of the United Nations, where we hope there will be 17 new goals and 169 targets. So it's become clear that the MDGs, while they have made a substantial amount of progress, more needs to be done. Goal 8 of the MDG was underpinned on the basis of creating a global partnership for development. Goal 17, the proposed Goal 17 of the SDGs, is about creating another global partnership to address the standard global challenges, but a few more have been added in. And I'm very pleased that issues such as addressing the pollution of oceans, the impact ocean and seas have on the coastal communities, addressing resilience, risk reduction issues, addressing water and sanitation, poverty, hunger, etc. And just going back to the point of poverty and hunger, I'm sure you've come across many NGOs who are doing great work. What the UN does is provides the norms and standards, but through organizations like the World Food Programme, which delivers aid to people who are in dire need in the poorest of countries, as well as help those who are in crisis situations, such as migrants who had to move because of conflict situations. But the policy direction is set by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, which is based in Rome, like the World Food Programme. And you would be interested to know that the top 2 leaders of the World Food Programme came from the US government. Catherine Bettini, who was former Undersecretary for Agriculture, was appointed about 18 years ago as the Executive Director of the World Food Programme. And then until about 4 years ago, Josette Chiran, also a product of the US government, another dynamic woman. And what is the best part about it is a woman. One of the goals which needs to be addressed by the 49% of the population around the world is to bring about parity and address the inequality of women in society. And I'll come to that in just a minute. And so I want to give you a comment about partnerships. And it's a very simple thing I want to mention to you. If we are to make a real dent in addressing the imbalances in society, we must work together to create a better humanity. The betterment of our common humanity can only be achieved through collaboration. We often say that partnerships might mean different things to different people, but there's one single unifying factor: relationships. You can only work together if you understand what the other person is looking for. We sometimes tend to feel that I'm willing to partner with you, providing you listen to what I want. We try and say to people, you share your thoughts, but you also listen to the other side, and to build those relationships. Partnerships start from the home, from marriage, from society, to business, to humanity. I am a strong believer that if we do work together, some of the challenges which need to be addressed in the developing world, and even in our backyards, in our underprivileged communities, can best be done through partnerships. So I take you back to 1997, when the idea of partnerships got rejuvenated at the UN. How many of you have heard about what Ted Turner did for the United Nations? Thank you. Yes. So, in 1997, excuse me, Ted Turner, the media mogul, comes to Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN. He had been elected as Secretary General in January 97. It was September of that year. He comes to Kofi Annan and said, Ted says to him, Kofi, I was worth $3 billion in January of 97. Now I'm worth $4 billion. And that initial billion does not do anything for me. He says, I love the UN. I love what the UN does, the work it performs. And I'd like to give that money to the UN. And at that time, the US was behind on its dues. So he says, I want to give you that money, and then I'll recover it from the US government. So Kofi Annan looks at him, looks around. 1 billion or 1 million? No, sir, 1 billion. Can we take that money? No, we cannot, sir. Because the UN budget is funded by member states of the United Nations. So if you look at the contributors to the UN budget, US contributes 22%, is the US government. And by extension, you contribute because you pay your taxes go to pay costs of the government, if you like. So we were kind of all taken aback. We were excited that this was coming through. Ted Turner was due to receive an award that evening from the United Nations Association. He went back, he was staying at the hotel. He got up the next morning, he says, I'm going to do this. And he announces it. And it was euphoria, saying, here's somebody who's a media mogul, philanthropist who comes in, commits $1 billion. And I have to tell you, that changed the face of the United Nations. We decided that this shouldn't be treated as traditional charity. It should be used to leverage other partners and other donors, other resources to create a sustainable planet. It was what we call the genesis of the multi-stakeholder partnership model, where we brought in academic expertise, the expertise leadership role of the private sector, the delivery systems of NGOs around the world, the normative function of the UN and international organizations, as well as the role of governments in this. So that started us on the course of really moving the supertanker towards a way of more closer engagement. And Kofi Annan encouraged it. Ban Ki-moon insisted on it. The current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, I have two enablers I need to have in place. If we are to achieve these global development goals, we must have the creative use of technology, information and communications technology, and we must do it on the platform of partnerships. He has proposed a partnership facility at the United Nations so that all of these initiatives can be threaded together through collaboration. So if I take you, the lady mentioned about the MDGs. These were the 8 goals which were put in place. They expire at the end of 2015. And as I said, Goal 8 is the Global Partnership for Development. And it's quite clear that when we embarked on all of these, we learned that many people were doing the same things. If you said, oh, we want to vaccinate children, people would say, me too. We want to educate young children in Burundi? Oh, me too. We said, can we work together? Can we find a way to collaborate? And increasingly, that is starting to happen. And if you look at, when I talk about the multi-stakeholder partnerships model, the private sector provides that management leadership. It has market-based rigor. It has technology innovation. The UN brings other components. So if you take a top quality NGO, the NGO knows how to deliver programs on the ground. The private sector can help also in getting the message out, for example. Today, as a result of the $1 billion donation, which was managed by Senator Tim Wirth from Colorado at that time, with really very foresightful. He, like Ted, knew that we need to do these things in a comprehensive way, and he wanted to use and leverage Ted's funds to attract more. Today, another $750 million have come in to address those MDGs. And the current CEO and president of the UN Foundation, Kathy Calvin, a very dynamic, vibrant lady, is taking that to the next level by saying we need to have more campaigns, we need to raise awareness of issues, whether it's women's equality, child undernourishment, education. Let's shine a light on those issues. Let's engage people around the world. Now, the UN also has started to appreciate very clearly that when we have a mammoth task ahead of us, these goals, by the way, are dependent on, initially, government funding. But actually, government funding is inadequate. USAID, for example, and other bilateral aid agencies, such as DFID, which is the Department for International Development in the UK, Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, and then Swedish CIDA, which is Swedish International Development Agency, and so on. Collectively, they provide about $120 to $150 billion. We feel private sector has a very big role to play. when I say private sector, I mean civil society, I mean new philanthropists. Excuse me. The arrival of people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett has focused on a very big way attention of the challenges faced in society, but also using those resources to create long-term sustainability. Within the UN system, the Secretary General launched various campaigns, and you might find it worthwhile having a look at those things. For example, Zero Hunger Challenge, which is an initiative to address hunger for children and people around the world on the basis that they should actually not go hungry overnight. There are 860 million children who go to bed without being fed. So when you think of that, we want to address that gap. Then there is a He for She campaign, which was created by the executive director of UN Women. That campaign is about raising awareness for men in society that we should respect the role of women and address those gaps, for example. I just wanted to give you some of these ideas. I want to share with you also the challenges which the UN faces when it does not engage with the private sector. Thank you very much. Thank you. So when I mentioned Zero Hunger Challenge, I also want to mention to you something called Every Woman, Every Child. That's, again, a global movement which brings together what is called H4 group, which is within the UN system, UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, WHO, and the World Bank, etc. The idea was very simple. Can we not just do things on your own? Can we just come together, please? So by his decisive action, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has been operating on the principle of partnerships. But then there are many people in the private sector, many foundations who are doing great work, and often we don't get a chance to highlight that. I'll give you an example. There is, I don't know if you were here when Gina Davis visited Arkansas. Who was present? Did you hear Gina Davis? Yes. Did you take her for a tour, personalized tour, sir? So Gina is a dynamic person. She's a wonderful actress, but she's actually a great humanitarian. She's created the Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media to focus attention of the creative community to think differently. How many of you have seen, well, you know, Barbie doll with a figure shaped like that? That's the attention, I'm sorry, the creative community focuses on. She's saying, actually, women can be presidents, women can be neuroscientists, women can be astronauts, women can be lawyers. Do not target them, do not put them in a different cup. Let's give them the opportunity. And she, working with UN Women and various others, does great work to promote that gender gap, to address that gender gap and bring about parity. I want to tell you a couple of other stories like that. Sherry Blair, who's the wife of the former Prime Minister of the UK, she created a foundation called the Sherry Blair Foundation for Women, essentially to empower women and get them business ready. She does programs for mentorship. She does programs on how to get access to capital, inclusion. so that when they go out, they feel comfortable. And I'm sorry, this has been the nature of society for centuries, that men have compartmentalized women for certain categories. And now things are changing. We want to make sure at least women have the opportunity. They can have the choice. So this is about making them ensure that they have that capability to do those things. The IDP Foundation, for example, they have something called the Rising Schools Program, which was created by Irene Pritzker and her daughter Liesel Pritzker. And it's about addressing bottom-of-the-ladder schools, private schools, who often get ignored in the traditional scheme of things about education processes. How? By ensuring that the owners get proper training on business acumen skills, how to run the schools properly, give them micro loans, have parent-teacher training programs. So there's a kind of an inclusionary attitude. All of these things could never happen without partnerships. My former office, the UN Office of Partnerships, for example, run by Anne de la Roche and Will Kennedy and Lucia Brigham, for example, their focus is, how can we be partnership facilitators? One of the biggest programs that Kofi Annan created, and which has expanded under the leadership of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, is the Global Compact. It is about committing companies to the 10 principles. 10 principles, 9 of them, 3 are focused on environment, 3 on human rights, 3 on better labor laws to be put in practice. And the 10th is the principle on corruption, addressing corruption issues. That means getting companies to commit to doing good as part of their DNA. Today, that is one of the largest, not one, the largest network around the world. It was created by Georg Kell, a visionary in this area. He knows how to create these networks, along with Professor John Ruggie, who was at that time the dean of the Columbia Business School. We stole him from there. And Georg Kell has created this wonderful institution. So there is Global Compact, there's the UN Office of Partnerships. And the SDG process, by the way, the Sustainable Development Goals process, is overseen by Amina Mohammed, who is the Secretary General's special representative on what we call the post-2015 development process. I'm sorry, those are bureaucratic terms, but I just thought you should know that the UN uses all of these long titles. The post-2015 development process is very simple. Are we going to be ready to help address these gaps, and how will we do that? She has the overall responsibility to also ensure good partnerships are developed so that the plight of those poor is addressed. And within the UN bureaucracy, Nikhil Seth, who's the director of the Sustainable Goals process, brought together many governments, in fact, all the governments, but many NGOs, many foundations, many private sector leaders, all through partnerships. But I want to tell you one thing. You hear this from me today. We'll put this in print. You think that's the only thing? I would venture to say there are probably 1 million plus real good partnerships taking place around the world. And you only hear about a few. We need to use the power of new technology to address that gap, that lacuna of saying, you should be able to access all of that. You should be able to do what I'd call a Google search for partnerships, what we call Google for development. should be able to search and say, I want to look at a partnership in Burundi on children's health. I want to look at a partnership on democracy in Senegal. I want to look at initiatives in Cambodia. So you're going to Cambodia, right? Yes. You want to be able to know what's happening on drug trafficking in Cambodia. How many people are operating there? Which governments, which NGOs, etc. So we are now thinking of creating kind of a virtual platform for partnerships, what we call a partnerships portal. We hope that in the coming months, we'll finalize that concept to create that so that it'll facilitate and provide easy access to that kind of information. So, as you can imagine, the idea of partnerships, smart partnerships, was its kind of a new title, but it's not new. You are doing it, other people are doing it, UN is doing it. What we need to do is to learn from each other and do it even better and do it more effectively. And I want to leave you with one thought. One person can influence policy, but it takes many to implement it. And you can do it. Think outside the box and say, what can I do to make that difference? And what's the favorite response? Yes, I can. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for that. We do have time for a couple questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
You mentioned a number of types of partnerships. Would you say something about the relationship with other coalition groups? For instance, there have been times when the African Union has not acted, the UN has had to. Would you say something about your relationship and when the UN has had to step in with other coalition partners?
Thank you. One of the challenges with some of the regional groups has been the lack of appropriate capacity to respond. Thank you for pointing out about the issue, the African Union. President Obasanjo, former president of Nigeria, started something called NEPAD, which is the New Partnership for Africa's Development, a peer review mechanism that Africa's problems are our problems. We should resolve them with better governance, better transparency. It used to be called the African Union Commission, and today the aim is very simple. There should be a peer review mechanism so that we provide that platform for transparency, but we also provide that platform for action. Action when there is conflict in our backyards, we should be ready to provide that. So if you look at the challenge, people in Africa, by different accounts, earn anywhere between $1 a day to $1.75 a day. Some might even be generous and say it's $2.50 a day. This is more expensive. So they don't have that capacity. And what now the UN is doing is saying, and when I say the UN, member states of the United Nations are coming together and saying, let's build that capacity in what is called ECOWAS, which is the African response capability for regional intervention, so that they have ownership to help redress these things. And I'm not sure whether we'll be able to see a substantial change overnight, but we are seeing that. We're seeing ownership by African Union leadership on this. Thank you.
Dr. Bruce.
It's very easy to talk about partnerships. It's very difficult to do them to true collaboration. What are the ways that the United Nations provides sort of win-win for various groups to come together to work collaboratively?
So your point couldn't be truer. I think I mentioned this earlier. It's easy to say that we should work together. By nature, human beings have the attitude, it's I, me, and myself. The concept of we and us is nice to speak, but less interesting to implement. Our challenge in implementing or bringing together some partners has often been the issue of understanding corporate cultures. Our challenge has also been that everybody wants to be recognized for what she or he is doing, or what their organization is doing. We've had situations where 5 different donors as in donor countries, major countries, who've insisted, I must have my placard, my flag there. And by the way, you must report on my standards, not by my fellow rich countries' standards, because my standard is the best. That thing is starting to change a little bit. And incidentally, this goes back to at least 20 years. I remember the Danish ambassador to the United Nations at that time, Ambassador Lodge, said, is the DAC countries, which are the developed countries, must come together and have uniform standards for reporting. Because when you make a contribution, or when, let's say USAID helps a country, they say you must report in the following manner. Yes, DFID is doing great work, but DFID's mission is slightly different to mine. CEDA says, all of the rest are doing great work, but ours is the best. They're now starting to come together and saying, we'll find ways to find that commonality. We have to understand what the stakeholder needs are, but we also want transparency and accountability of our resources. The challenge comes in is we give the money, or member states give the money to the Ministry of Health, for example, to introduce prevention or HIV/AIDS training or vaccine distribution, etc. Each one has a different parameter to it. We still don't have those standard norms which we've adopted, although we've adopted officially the norms, but the implementation norms are different to the policy norms. We are hopeful that as the new Sustainable Development Goals kick in, there'll be a lot more cohesion from the donors as well as the recipients. And if you notice, the missing link here is the stakeholders. When I say recipients, we say the recipient countries, but it's the stakeholders on the ground who we should be including. Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you, Mr. DeSalle. My name is Andrew Forsman. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. So one of the things that we study here are many different authors and experts' ideas about aid and the Millennium Development Goals. There are some who are big proponents of it and others who are not. And then we have many in the middle who say we have different ideas about what you call smart philanthropy. And so I wondered if you might further define for us your definition of smart philanthropy and talk about ways that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be different from the previous Millennium Development Goals.
Thank you. Very good question, actually. Smart philanthropy, again, it's like the term partnerships. It can mean different things to different people. We feel that when you give traditional charity, you notice I'm not talking about smart charity even anymore. When you give traditional charity, you get a sense of feeling that I've helped somebody. You get stopped on the street, a homeless person, you give that homeless person $1, that homeless person thanks you profusely, you go home and you feel satisfied, you've done something. But you've done nothing, with due respect. If you say, I'm going to help the person clean up, give him a meal, and then get him a bed somewhere, I'm sorry, you still haven't done anything except your guilt feeling of saying, I'm giving something to somebody. Smart philanthropy is where you get that person a job. You help train that person. The traditional, well-used expression of teach a man how to fish. I know it's not that easy. You cannot do it all the time, every day, in every initiative. But the person is homeless for reasons sometimes we don't even know about. I've seen cases of people who lost their jobs, who become homeless. Smart people, but they didn't have the opportunity. That's how we help them. We try and help them find jobs. Not by saying, I'll give you $10 so you won't be hungry for the next 2 days. Mothers who've been let go by their husbands, kicked out of their homes, they've had to live in squalid conditions because they have not been trained to work. Whose fault is it? Is it the women's fault or the men's fault? We never accept those blames. I'm a strong believer that we should address that the men should take responsibility for those things to address that inequality. Now, do you think the SDGs will resolve that? I'm not sure. I'm sorry to tell you. I'm not sure that the mentality of men in society will change that. I'm not sure that people will see smart philanthropy as a necessity or sustainability as a necessity. We've been talking about this for at least 30 years. We go back to before Rio, the first Rio summit, in 1992. Rio Plus 20 happened in 2012. Renewed commitment for sustainable development. You think that now it's a done deal? Suddenly you're finding the financial crisis means governments are saying, I don't have the money to give you. So technical assistance is starting to come down. So smart philanthropists are coming in and saying, Bill Gates is not saying, I'll give you that money, I'll find you solutions. I won't give you money for medicine, I'm going to find you a vaccine, for example. And by the way, when I give you money for vaccines, I want to look at it from a business plan perspective. Not just to say, don't worry, you can do research for the next 15 years, and the outcomes we can worry about. So that mindset change can take place when people like yourselves can change that. Because you are the new brand of consumers who are demanding more. You realize that society cannot continue on this basis when we are taking everything from the planet and not replacing it. And the millennials are saying, we want to change that. And one great example of that kind of new thinking which is coming out, by the way, is actually taking place in New York, which is what President Clinton started about 10 years ago. His mission was very simple. Governments are very important. They must do their jobs. But there are hundreds of thousands of people who are social entrepreneurs or who have that passion for doing well and doing good, who have that commitment to creating shared value for society, who have that commitment for people, planet, and profit. to say, can we come together and help create sustainability? What takes place at the Clinton Global Initiative is about sustainability. It's about creating that kind of commitment to society on a long-term basis. And you guys can be part of that movement. Thank you.
Mayor, thank you so much for coming to Little Rock.